Probably not unlike many of you, I grew up playing a lot of games based on popular movies or characters. But Spider-Man games were the ones that I have the most memories with, hands down. So given the unrelenting success of Marvel's cinematic universe, many Marvel superheroes have been cast into the mainstream for the first time ever. These characters that were originally portrayed as these goofy, stereotypical comic book characters are now being played and portrayed by these beautiful, charming specimens of human beings. Like, do you think people would be nearly as hyped for Thor nowadays if he looked like this? More than likely, no. But people will go nuts over this scene in Infinity War.
Bring me Thanos!
Myself included. I mean, even my simple country father looked at me after this scene and said, Thor's bad to the bone, ain't he? But behind all of these super soldier gods, there is one man who has never been portrayed as someone who has the power of the world in his hands. And that man is Spider-Man. So we're going to talk about some video games now. Spider-Man games have always been something I try to keep up with as much as I can. I followed and completed the video game adaptations of all 3 Sam Raimi films. I found 1 to be a great experience at the time, 2 was one of my favorite PS2 games of all time, and I really enjoyed 3 even though it kind of, brought nothing new to the table. And I know Elliot has told me how he remembers playing through the first Neversoft Spider-Man game from 2002, as well as the GameCube version of Spider-Man 2 before moving on to the modern area with Beanox's Shattered Dimensions and the Amazing Spider-Man adaptations. And Spider-Man Friend or Foe was a great time for me and Jake as kids. So over the years, I feel like everyone has grown in interesting directions, and each come into a separate appreciation for Spider-Man as a character. Most having fallen in love with a different aspect or quality of the hero. Be it the strength and ferocity that some versions portray, the grace and agility of movement for some adaptations, or the more wholesome and comedic elements of certain versions of the character and his supporting cast.
Surf the web, surf the web.
Shut up, Brock. All of us have an attachment and love for Spider-Man and his amazing friends. So given the resounding success of that new Spidey game that came out, I figured it'd be a cool idea to see how I remember some of the webhead's old games, and try some out that I've yet to play. So I was at a friend's house one night and we were playing Xbox 360. After some amount of time, he popped in a game that I had never seen before, Spider-Man Web of Shadows, and I immediately fell in love. I recall begging and pleading with my mom, asking if there was anything I could do to get that game somehow. And I'm not sure how exactly, but I got it. And when I say I had fallen in love, I meant it. I even finished it before my friend did. I was so hooked. The ability to change between the fast, agile red suit and the demonic crowd control of the symbiote suit was the best thing about the game for me. The combat had such a unique cinematic feel to it that no other Spider-Man game had been able to hit just right for me. But the sheer utility of Spider-Man didn't stop with the changes to his fighting abilities. He also had many more options for traversal and swinging around New York. The web swinging in specific was very precise and creatively liberating. I always felt like I was in control of where I wanted to go and how I wanted to get there at all times. The games that came before it had good systems for swinging, especially 2 with its actual physics-based system, but Web of Shadows just hit that sweet spot for me personally. And I know, the web lines don't actually attach to the buildings, I get it. But for me, the feeling of the swinging was much more important than the purity of it, if you get what I'm saying. Plus, being able to Naruto run up and down walls was pretty sweet. But even though it had the freedom of mobility most games wish they could replicate, and some of my favorite boss fights in gaming history, and some nice looking stylized visuals, it had a lot of problems that really can't be overlooked, especially going back to it now. While the story has an interesting premise, it's told with an extremely schizophrenic pace. The game can be broken up into 3 chapters, essentially. Chapter 1 comes after a very brief tutorial prologue and takes place in a very healthy New York City. You tussle with local crime and thugs while being slowly introduced to some of the different enemies as well. But a lot of the characters in the beginning of Chapter 1 have very little significance in the plot overall. By the time Chapter 2 rolls around and the city is starting to turn into a quarantine zone, all these little local crimes have taken a backseat to the larger symbiote threat. It makes sense, but it feels like it was fumbled, and some of the characters such as MJ and even Peter at times are kinda dumb, moody sounding, and just unlikable.
I have to get to Wolverine.
And while I'm sure it's meant to encourage multiple playthroughs, the main story is a little on the short side. Also, the game is glitchy as hell. The PC port in particular is borderline unplayable.
Look, I promise, I won't use it again.
Promise? We are way past that.
What the fuck is wrong with... Okay. So unsurprisingly, the game did not sell well. So what did they do? They went and changed the Spider-Man formula up again with Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. And it's not a bad game, but it's just not for me. Yeah, I know, but it doesn't feel like a Spider-Man game to me, man. I think it's mainly due to it being a linear, level-based game, as opposed to the borderline tradition of Spider-Man titles being an open world. And let me reiterate, I don't think Shattered Dimensions is a bad game. I just find that it doesn't really highlight what I find to be the best qualities of a Spider-Man game. It's a very functional and competent adventure in its own right. I just don't find there to be anything groundbreaking about it. The levels are all stylized well and provide unique atmosphere for each of their visits, but that's about where my praise using the word unique will stop. The combat is dreadfully repetitive. I have to commend the special abilities Ultimate and 2099 have to keep things from being, like Ursula levels of repetitive, but a slowdown and rage mechanic can only do so much to alleviate the bare bones things each Spider-Man can do. And God have mercy on the Amazing Spider-Man, his levels just bore me to sleep. It's about 45 minutes to an hour for each level, which sounds good when you're thinking of getting your money's worth for the paid value of the game. But for me personally, I would prefer a bit more of a Reader's Digest version of some of these levels. And while they're each stylistically different from one another, I think I get sick of the same locales within that hour of playtime. Fighting through the same reskin enemies I've already taken down in the last level with another Spider-Man began to wear thin on me. But that is my favorite aspect of Shattered Dimensions by far. Having the veterans of the Spider-Man voice acting lineage come in to bring life to all these different versions of the character was a brilliant choice. And I also really dig the different renditions of Spider-Man's villains for each of the different dimensions. I know it sounds like I hate Shattered Dimensions, but that's simply not true. I think that it's a great celebration of the webhead's history, and even if I think the combat is boring and repetitious compared to its siblings, that doesn't mean it's not worth playing, because it certainly is. So this is where I effectively fell off of Spider-Man games for a little while. I never really cared for anything, including the films from the Amazing Spider-Man reboot series, and when I saw gameplay footage for the video game tie-ins, I was always thinking, why would you not just play the Arkham series instead of this thing? The 2 games that were released range from decent to spectacularly bad. I was fortunate enough to play the bad ones, so we will not be talking about it very much. Now, on to the main event. Insomniac Games was always one of those developers that had always kind of been there since I started playing games. They created the Ratchet & Clank series for starters, which I played the heck out of growing up. But when the trailers for a game called Sunset Overdrive were floating around and poking fun at the oversaturation of dark, gritty shooters in the market at the time, I had to know what geniuses were behind it. But just like that, they don't waste any time letting you know their names. I got the game and I played it to near completion. It made me appreciate those old Ratchet & Clank style games with the ridiculous arsenals and the comedy to back it all up. It's one of, if not the best Xbox One exclusive out there right now. But then, they kind of disappeared again. I saw that they remade the original Ratchet & Clank, which was cool, but that was about all I remember hearing for quite a while. Until Sony's E3 2016 press conference, that is. Amidst the buzz of all of Sony's AAA-filled conference, everyone watching was in for quite an unexpected surprise. At the very end of the conference, there was a trailer for a brand new Spider-Man game being developed by Insomniac. This took me by surprise, and I was intrigued by the decision to put Insomniac on the job. They almost never work with or develop products for other intellectual properties. They almost exclusively create things based on their own, well, creations. But now they're making a Spider-Man game. And at the time when Spider-Man's popularity is through the roof. But you know what they say, hindsight is 20/20. Insomniac's Spider-Man. It's such an incredible game, man. It's a phenomenal game. An easy 9 or even 10 out of 10. Let's establish that right now. Being built in a modified version of the Sunset Overdrive engine, how could it not be amazing? But as I was playing through it, I was struck with all the fond good times and muscle memories from all the web-slinging games I had experienced in the past. In my opinion, the game utilizes very simple systems, but executes them with near perfection. It takes very few risks as far as combat, web swinging, and even the mission structures go. Let's begin with the combat though. If you've played any Arkham game, then you'll be able to jump in here fairly easily.
Hold up, you said you didn't like the Amazing Spider-Man games because they were too much like the Batman games.
Yeah, I know what I said. Shut up and just hear me out. With the Amazingly Garfield Spider-Man games, you can visually see the struggle at play. The game is always seemingly at war with itself and the systems under the hood. And when it does happen to grab my attention, it's immediately undercut by something extremely laughable like this abomination. It may take the formula from the Arkham games, but it doesn't use it like Batman, or even the fucking PS4 game. But with the PS4 title, you can believe that you're watching a Spider-Man movie when you're in a brawl. The animations and beautifully dynamic camera angles help to round out the feeling of simple fluidity in the combat. It's that word immersion that people like to bring up a lot in game analysis. My interpretation of immersion is best described through the method of effortlessly using my surroundings in the manner that I think Spider-Man would in the game. Bouncing off a wall to punch a dude, jumping just a bit in the air to add some gravity to my punch. All those little nuanced optional maneuvers are some of my favorite things in this simply approachable experience. Now, my frequent use of the word simple is not to say that I think the combat is boring or anything. It's honestly exactly the opposite. But Spider-Man realistically only has a limited number of options to take into consideration that will truly change the way you have to look at a fight. Not a whole lot of strategy has to be applied to any given encounter. If an enemy isn't taking damage from your regular combo, then the game has taught you to quickly try a few things to get the pace moving again. Dodge towards them at the correct time, get them into the air, throw something at them, or immobilize them with one of your many web-based gadgets. And even still, with the appropriate upgrades to your arsenal, you can even execute the bigger brawlers immediately with a focus bar or two. There are a lot of fun and varying ways to take down enemies, but you won't be forced to change up your tactics beyond these simple maneuvers. But playing around with the different gadgets, suit powers, mods, and mix-ups makes for an interesting combat experience to mess around with for sure. I want to highlight the gadgets in particular. That whimsical Insomniac touch is so present with the slowing down of time to grab the right tool from that second in battle and make those amazing cinematic moments come to life. But I don't even think the simplicity and ease of comprehension is a weakness in the slightest. It's a simple to comprehend system that lends itself to its own accessibility. Even after playing and completing several other Spider-Man games after completing PS4, I was able to jump back into the first DLC package like nothing had changed. And once again, it's visually breathtaking at points. Even while the same exact things and merits can be said about the stealth sections in it as well. With a few minor hiccups, admittedly. I think that Spider-Man is an oddly fitting character to use when stealth gameplay is the topic of discussion. I mean, a bright red and blue suit doesn't scream, "Fear me." But I'm still the easiest person I know to scare, so it's whatever.
But boy, does he make that thing work, baby.
I think the beginning of the warehouse missions in particular are such a joy to exploit with your sneaky tactics. It gives you the chance to take out a few guys before the real brawl inevitably kicks off, but I have a few things that kind of bug me about it. Mainly, you're not allowed to take down enemies when crawling up walls or ceilings. This is incredibly frustrating and doesn't at all
make you feel like Spider-Man?
It just seems like a major oversight. When going back and playing Shattered Dimensions Noir missions, I was pleasantly surprised when I discovered you could perform wall takedowns. The Noir Spider-Man has a good weight and feels like he was made for nothing but living in the shadows. Plus, the enemies aren't brain dead. They actually have functioning ears, and hear when a friend is being punched. Well, honestly, there isn't such a thing as a smart Spider-Man enemy in these games. But to be fair, this issue isn't exclusive to Spider-Man PS4 by a long shot. Even an incredibly immersive game like The Last of Us has stealth sections where you're supposed to be as quiet as a mouse, yet you have situations like this. It's just a video gamey and nitpicky complaint, I know, but I just like that you're not immediately free to go nuts as soon as one of the enemies in a pair turns around, and oh boy, the gadgets! They all add layer after layer of potential strategy to these sneaking encounters. My personal favorites on and off alert was easily the trip mine and web bombs. And to be 100% fair, Noir's stealth sections are roughly a quarter of the whole game, having levels specifically designed for that one type of playstyle versus having to accommodate for a preferred method of approaching the situation are two very different things. Seeing as how much less versatile Noir is in a fistfight when compared to PS4, it's not so much a player choice as it is a downright disadvantage to take enemies head on. But I'd argue vehemently that that was intentional. Player choice coupled with character limitations and strength seems to be the kind of dichotomy I'm trying to present to you here. And it would be unfair to hold this against either game. Noir may have some of my preferences for physically getting down in the dark, but he doesn't have the utility that this little fella does. But back on combat, I have to say that as far as just pure fighting goes, I think Web of Shadows and PS4 are a tie in quality for me, but each for very different reasons. While the enemy variety of Web of Shadows does outsize the PS4 title, I don't think it necessarily has a leg up on PS4. There are large enemies that can't be web zipped at, large enemies that are more vulnerable to certain suits, and so on and so forth. But with my recent in-depth look at both games, I don't think that there are any enemies that force you to use any specific moves from either suit. Sure, one arsenal might be better suited for a specific enemy, but that doesn't mean that said enemy stands to fare much better comparatively to either suit in particular. And sure, the symbiote nests as an example are much less dangerous to take down if they're webbed shut before you engage them with the red suit, but you can just as easily over-counter them or take them out from a distance with anything else. These things being said, I think that Web of Shadows' combat system is reflective of its enemies' more fantastic and ferocious nature. The game throws these larger and more otherworldly enemies at you, while simultaneously giving you equally ludicrous ways of taking care of them. But this is when I started to realize we're really comparing apples and oranges here, even if it is the same character in question. I find that Insomniac's specific take on their Spider-Man's combat is more focused on the hair-splitting reaction times and reality-grounded physicality. I think the perfect example of this dichotomy is in the boss battles each game hosts in contrast to each other. So with the boss battles in Web of Shadows, you're usually fighting a character that is just as agile as you are, and it is your job to overpower and outmaneuver them. Whether that be the winning combination, discover a way to break through their cycles, or just willpower your way to victory, there rarely ever feels like one specific way you're supposed to complete any given fight. You might have been favoring the crowd control of the black suit, but then get to Wolverine's boss fight and be severely limited on options because you didn't prioritize the speed and one-on-one capabilities of the red suit. And then after 1 or 2 trips through New Game Plus, you're free to power through the game with both arsenals fully upgraded and usable at any given moment, unleashing all kinds of madness on these super destructive enemies, but all while getting the pain dished back to you in just as much of an off-the-wall comic book type of way. But back in the new installment, things feel like they fly a little bit closer to the ground. You still have an encounter with Vulture like in Web of Shadows, and not much is different, but it's enough to make you realize some not so subtle differences. In Web of Shadows, he has telepathically controlled swords for wings. You're dodging them, swinging them around, and doing all sorts of ridiculous stuff with them while fighting him. Now moving back into Insomniac's game, the addition of Electro makes the fight feel somewhat more plausible. Flying around and shooting lightning isn't really plausible, I'm aware of that, but the little details sell it for me. There's no super intricate flips, over-the-top fight choreography or anything. It's just Spider-Man trying to keep himself alive while trying to do the same for these guys who inversely want him dead. Also, on a side note, I really like how they give you a chance to familiarize yourself with each boss's boss patterns before putting you against them both at the same time. That's some Mega Man X shit I can get behind. It's a really cool way to keep the connected thread of Spider-Man and Peter Parker's duality omnipresent, if you will. Speaking of Peter Parker, I don't feel like I'm exaggerating at all when I say that I truly believe this is the best iteration of Peter we've ever gotten. Outside of Tom Holland's performances, of course. Yuri Lowenthal. I have been hearing this man's voice for apparently quite some time, but I had no idea. He's the man behind Ben from Ben 10 Omniverse, Marth in Smash Bros., and the new voice of Mercury in Rooster Teeth's animated show RWBY. I plan on keeping up with this man for quite a while to come. Consider me a fan after today. Not to mention the amazing Laura Bailey as Mary Jane. The story, no joke, is my favorite thing about this game. I adore the characterization of literally everyone. I didn't feel like anyone or anything was truly forced narrative-wise. However, if there is one thing in the game that are the most universally conflicting segments, it's the Miles and MJ sneaking pieces. There are more of these stupid as hell stealth missions that are almost as brain dead as the AI in them. I mean, these people must be legally blind and not have object permanence. I understand why these are in the game, I really do. They help develop and set up moments for the most poignant characters to have those intense relationships that fuel the most powerful moments in the game. But I think they're way too frequent, and more often than not, they overstay their welcome. Even if things do get a little bit more interesting sometimes, like when MJ gets a stun gun, but other than that, I always just rush through these to get back to the legitimately entertaining stealth sections and see what happens next in the plot. But now that we're on the topic of character interactions and relationships, I think Peter is at his most captivating when he has to navigate his life interactions, most notably with Dr. Octavius and MJ. In contrast with Web of Shadows, some character interactions with Spider-Man fell flat compared to others. And in the case of Moon Knight, his entire inclusion just felt like a means to an optional end. You help him out in the beginning of the game, so you have the option for him to take you to Rikers Island should you refuse Vulture after, kick his ass. And some characters even had their significance shoved aside when bigger story beats began to take off. I'm looking at you, Cage, but I am a sucker for the optional side conversations Spider-Man can have with all the heroes and villains. Looking at Luke again.
So, how did you get in this whole superhero business anyway?
A long story. I got accused of some stuff I
got bitten by a spider.
No.
Yeah.
And you named yourself Spider-Man. Cool.
As a
I
kid.
legitimately laugh at this stuff. However, that's not to say that the story as a whole is completely hot garbage in Web of Shadows, but when comparing it to the narrative of the PS4 title, it's just not as solid by a landslide. I think the best way to summarize Spider-Man PS4 is that it's like that one amazing song on the radio. It's such a great song and there's no doubt about it. You go out and you buy it as soon as you hear it. There are so many great things about it, and so many little sounds and nuances and secrets that you will only notice and discover after you keep coming back to it. And you will want to keep coming back to it. Even though it does build off of structures that other artists have used before, the song added so many great things and fresh new sounds to set itself way up high on a new level. But unfortunately, that song's runtime will end. So all you can do is hit the repeat button and wait for the artist to get back in the studio to make more of those amazing songs. And I've listened to this song so much so that I've literally done everything it has to offer, and I am feverishly awaiting the rest of the DLC. And I think Marvel and Sony will be calling Insomniac soon on a follow-up title. But what is your favorite childhood Spider-Man game? I can't wait to hear about it in comments below. But anyway, I appreciate you for watching. So thanks for stopping by and have a great day.